I'm John Weiss. If you remember, I'm the leader of the Remembering Our Heroes organization, and we are going to make an effort today to get back with this program by doing some videos that will maintain continuity between the guest speakers that you can see here in the Senior Resource Center and with these small presentations. We're not sure when we'll be back, and in the near term we probably will go back to our Brightmoor location for a little while at least, but Bruce Patterson will get you the information as to where we're going and how to access this video. So we'll begin with the Battle of Camden, and we'll look forward to your feedback on it. The Battle of Camden is not one of the bigger battles, that you might have learned about in high school or college, but it is an important battle in the fact that it diverted attention from the New England states and the Middle Atlantic states to the south. At this point, the British people had been in war for 4 years, and they in the Parliament were very tired of the expense in terms of manpower lost and the costs of running this war 3,000 miles from the motherland. The effort here was considered important because the southern states, of all the states, would probably be the most responsive to coming back to the British Crown. They were one of the wealthiest areas with large plantations that produced a lot of the goods that were needed by the British manufacturing sector and for consumer requirements. This is the area of operations for the Southern Campaign. You can see this is a relatively small period of time. In fact, I teach a course on this at Ollie, and we cover these major battles in the yellow highlighted areas. But of course today we'll only talk about the first battle. 8,000 men moved south under the new commander of the North American operations, General Henry Clinton. He quickly captured Charleston and started to move north. He, however, was losing confidence in his role to be played in the South. So he immediately went back to New York and gave the command of the Southern forces over to Lord Earl Cornwallis, someone that you will remember ended up surrendering his army at Yorktown, Virginia. The attack against Charleston turned into a siege. In other words, they surrounded the city and they wanted to starve the American Continental Army into surrender, and it did do that. It was a relatively bloodless victory for the British because they isolated them from their reinforcements, the Americans from their reinforcements, and as a result, they had to surrender. Big disaster for the United States, because 3,300 Continentals ended up surrendering along with many militia units. Continentals were the equivalent of the very trained British soldiers. They were carefully trained and in many cases more effective than their British regular counterparts because General von Steuben trained them to a high standard. So Clinton returned to New York, leaving behind 8,000 good troops, and he was given the mission to sweep through the Carolinas. Georgia and the Carolina coast was already secure, into the backwoods area up to the mountains, and make sure that the entire 3 colonies would stay under British loyalty. If they had an opportunity, they would also invade through North Carolina to Virginia. One of the disasters that made the fall of Charleston even worse was the fact that the Continentals sent down a small number of Virginia soldiers, about 500, who were supposed to join up with the Charleston forces, but stopped when they found out Charleston fell. Waxhaws is the place where the Continental reinforcements were defeated. It's pretty discouraging to see the casualty figures, 113 killed, 200 wounded. That's out of a total of 400 to 500. And there were other injured and sick soldiers in those ranks too. One of the reasons the casualties were so high, the man that attacked the Americans was a man named Gnaster Tarleton. He was a lieutenant colonel, very ambitious young man. He was only 27 years old, and he wanted to make a name for himself. So he moved with cavalry very quickly, struck hard, and didn't always follow the rules of war. So some of those killed and many of the wounded resulted after the Americans were trying to surrender, and many of the wounded that were sick were also bayoneted. As a result of this, two big expressions came about in the southern states. One is Tarleton's quarter, which means he'll kill you even if you have surrendered, which was against the law of war in those days, and Bloody Band for the same reason. This massacre was supposed to try to intimidate the people that were loyal to the cause of independence, but in fact, they probably drove more people into the arms of the Patriots than trying to turn them towards the British leadership. And as a result, there were guerrilla leaders, partisans as they were called, who would attack the British line of communications, LOC, which you see over there, which is basically the supply lines that an army needs to make sure they can stay in the field and fight. I'll just name three of the big partisan leaders. One is Thomas Sumter, Andrew Pickens, who was very valuable in working alongside the Continental soldiers in the type of European battles that were needed to win the war, and Francis Marion, who many of you probably know as the Swamp Fox if you ever saw any of the Walt Disney shows. So several events had to occur before these two armies would meet at Camden. They realized that Camden was an important tactical goal of both armies because it was a system of network of roads, and the roads were not very good in the South. It was developed mostly along the lines of rivers. Cornwallis was the ultimate professional. He had served in the British Army from 1776 up to 1780 in the north, where the main activities occurred. The battles of around New York City, around New Jersey, Trenton, Princeton, Monmouth, Brandywine, and he was superb. He was a great leader. His men respected him and would do anything for him. He knew many of the aspects of warfare beyond just the fighting on the battlefield. He understood about supplies being available, that you needed to have security on the march, which means you put out people on your flanks so that you couldn't be ambushed, and the role of good reconnaissance. The British Army was totally unaware of what the southern areas looked like. There was a tidewater area, the Piedmont, and the mountainous area out to the west. They didn't realize how many of these rivers that were listed there were very dangerous rivers in times of thaws. So they needed good reconnaissance effort. Gates, who was not Washington's choice, but he was the commander that the Continental Congress sent down there to oversee the operations on the American side. He was a very arrogant guy. He was known for winning the Battle of Saratoga, and in fact he was 30 miles behind the lines and shouldn't have gotten any credit for the win. He refused to coordinate with the guerrilla leaders, the Francis Marion, Sumter, and Pickens. He thought they were below him, to deal with them. He also was a guy that couldn't make a decision. So he was figuring out what to do as he was moving down towards Camden. And you can see here, he covered 120 miles in 14 days. That's very poor for light infantry type of army. At the last minute, however, he decided to get aggressive. He made a long night march, which is very difficult, even if you're taking it at a slower pace, and he exhausted his troops. So on the one hand, you see Cornwallis prepared for everything. His men are rested, fed, and everything, and Gates is going off to battle, really not knowing what he's doing. Here's a summary of the opposing armies. The strength of the Continental Army was in their Continentals. Again, regular type soldiers who were the equivalent of their British counterparts that were professional soldiers. They also had dragoons, which are light cavalry. These are guys that don't fight per se right on the battlefield, but they do reconnaissance and they screen the army's forces against the enemy, so the enemy doesn't know what's coming up at them. And there were 2,000 militia from North Carolina primarily, but some from Virginia as well, which probably is a good indication of how angry the Patriots were in having those men basically murdered on the battlefield at Waxhaws. The British Army had 1,000, 1,100 regulars of 4 very well-known British regiments that had made a name for themselves in the European wars. They also had cavalry, 120 cavalry, which is Banastre Tarleton's cavalry, the ones that did the massacre. And they had Tory militia. Okay, now the the American militia really wasn't very well trained. They would be equivalent to if you were living in your neighborhood, all the men and boys in the neighborhood showing up at a location and then marching off to war. They might know how to handle a firearm, but they weren't really used to working together. I mean, they drilled together sometimes. The Tory militia in this case, were very well trained. Not as good as the British regulars, but they were an asset in the battle. Because of the night march, the two cavalry forces met each other in the middle of the night, and it was a chaotic type of battle. But they did a good job of slowing down their enemy, their opponents, so that the main army could assemble. Both sides were ready for the battle, and they, as you know, in those days they lined up shoulder to shoulder basically in their formations, and they went at each other. This is a rough view of the battlefield, just to show you how the two armies were arrayed. The American army was in the north. Camden is down here. And they started off with a pretty good idea. They had an idea that the militia might be able to do some damage and slow the British down in the front. They were very good marksmen because they needed weapons to protect themselves against the hostile Indians, as well as to kill game. The real strength of the army was these continental units, Maryland and Delaware Continentals, who happened to be the best units under Washington's command up in the New Jersey, New York area. They had been in all the major battles, and they had many times saved the entire army when the army was defeated. They did have one small group of infantry here that was a part of this Maryland battalion. And again, these were reliable soldiers that Gates could count on. On the British side, this little pink line here is where the British Army was split in two. One of the areas had 3 regiments, about 300 men each, under a General Webster, who had great fame fighting the Europeans in the 7 Years' War, in which the North American version of that was called the French and Indian Wars. Lord Rawdon was a local Tory who had some military experience, and he was a very good commander, and he had some good soldiers on his side as well. So the battle will commence with 2 different wings of the British Army going at the Americans. And the British were going to start by moving off, marching towards the American lines. So Gates, after screwing around for 2 weeks, decides to rush into this thing. He did get his men deployed, but they had not eaten in 2 or 3 days. When they finally did get to the battle, close to the battlefield the night before, the only thing he could offer them was green apples and molasses. This is a recipe for disaster because it does things to the bowels, and you can't really fight a battle if your men have to go running off somewhere to take care of bodily functions. They were also a little disorganized, maybe not so much as not being in their proper units, but from the standpoint of being scared. Would they all be brought together at the same time and able to fight? But this was good terrain for fighting, with the Americans having so many militia, because the swamps on either side of the battlefield would keep the British from trying to get around behind them, and that is an army's worst nightmare, is when the enemy gets behind you or on your flank. You're oriented towards the front, towards your enemy, and then all of a sudden he shows up behind you. That's a recipe for causing a rout, the army breaking and running away. Again, a little summary here. Even though it looked like the Continental Army outnumbered the British, qualitatively they were about even, except in terms of generalship, because Cornwallis was a much better general. Okay, starting off on the battle, this side, the left flank, was basically in a stalemate, trying to fight the Continentals, the very highly trained Maryland and Delaware troops. They basically kept exchanging fire, and there was really not much movement on the battlefield. As long as they held, though, that was good for the American army. However, on the right wing of the British Army, they made a lot of progress. The North Carolina and Virginia militia, they were doing what they were told to do, which was to fire, try to kill some of the enemy officers, take measured shots so that they could wear down the British. And the British got most of their losses in the battle at this stage. There was a big wide open field, and they were, because many of the militia had rifles, they were being shot at from 100 to 150 yards away, whereas the muskets the British had were only effective to maybe 30 or 40 yards. So they did a lot of damage, wounded and killed a lot of the soldiers and many of the officers, the British officers. What happened, the North Carolina and Virginia militia, as you can see, moved back from this line here, and they were in relatively good order, but ready to break. Some of them already were throwing down their canteens and backpacks and everything like that. And the 1st Maryland, these were hardcore, very well-trained troops, came around and caught Webster, in the middle of his assault, and that's saved the day for a while. And again, with the American right flanks staying in their position, there was still some chance. Unfortunately, when the North Carolina and Virginia militia took off, Gates took off too. I told you he was not exactly a gutsy type of commander. Many historians say he was an out-and-out coward. In any case, this is what happens, in that Webster's troops did end up doing the unthinkable for the Americans as they come around behind them. So they're basically surrounded. Now, even though Gates should never have left the battlefield, he should have been encouraging his men to fight on, there was a General DeKalb who should have probably had command of this army. He's a German, I wouldn't call him a mercenary, but he fought in the Great Wars under Frederick the Great, and he was a great courageous and a smart general. And he held these very well-trained Maryland and Delaware troops together. In any case, even if they couldn't win the battle now, at least they could buy time for the rest of the Americans who took off to get safely out of the battle area. He was mortally wounded. In fact, we'll go into that a little later. And here I'm getting sarcastic here. The hero of Saratoga, that's how they referred to General Gates from his victory up in New York State. He fled the battlefield with the militia. Instead of encouraging them to fight, he got ahead of them. He got on a horse, and in 100 miles he covered in 3 days. Now that is some good riding and probably involved some kind of exchanging horses several times along the way, but it certainly didn't reflect on him being a brave commander. So that's the militia taking off. So the battle basically ended there, even though the Americans fought on with DeKalb. They ended up pulling themselves out of it, and most of them survived. The British had a pretty good day of it. However, you can see that out of their 2,000 men, they had quite a few that were wounded. And that was mostly because of the militia and the great battle that the Maryland and Delaware men put up. This is considered a tactical victory, which means that the army that recovered the field, in other words, they were there while the other guys took off, that would be a tactical victory. Many people thought that it was a strategic victory for the British, but because they were then ready to finish the conquering South Carolina and getting ready to invade North Carolina. The Americans had a rough day. They had 600 dead. Most of them were the Continentals, the Delaware and Maryland troops, and a great number wounded, and 500 of the wounded captured. The Continentals, it says, were decimated, and that's true. They never recovered their full strength again to the end of the war. These were relatively small states in population, and so they sent reinforcements or replacements as much as they could, but they were never going to be the same units. But they stayed to fight through the whole war through 1783. There were no organized forces left to stop the British, so it looked like Cornwallis could make it all the way up to Virginia. However, the militia, the guerrillas, the partisans, weren't going to allow the British to advance any further, so they started a lot of raids on Tory headquarters and on supply lines and controlling the bridges and things like that, so that Cornwallis couldn't get his supplies and he couldn't really make the invasion. So the benefit of the victory for the British was the Loyalists, or Tories, they were encouraged to start enlisting into the British Army, or doing their share by providing supplies, food, wagons, and things that Cornwallis needed to invade North Carolina. As I mentioned before, the war was now 4 years old, and many people in the British Isles thought this was a waste of manpower and a waste of their treasure to try to bring Englishmen back to a country that had abused it. Cornwallis, who was ready to invade North Carolina, thought about it a little bit more, and he delayed his pursuit for 3 weeks. Part of that is because he took such heavy casualties. If you can imagine, between the Americans and the British, after the battle, there were almost 1,000 men that needed to be tended to, not even including the men that had to be buried. And Camden itself probably had less than 500 people, men, women, and children. So there was a real disaster there, and he couldn't just leave with all that behind it. Another thing is he started to see Francis Marion and Sumter and Pickens, the partisan leaders, started attacking his supplies and actually trying to catch some of his guys away from the main body and do as much damage as they could. However, Tarleton was still out to make a name for himself, and just 3 days after the battle, he ended up defeating Sumter, the guy that had the most forces among the partisans. And again, they got a little sloppy on security, so they were ambushed and surprised. And his losses were 150 dead and 300 captured. Almost all of his command was wiped out. And the British only lost 16 killed and wounded. And by the way, there were 100 Tories that had been captured by Sumter just about a month before that, and they were being used for labor or whatever, and they were freed, and they came back. Not only were they now available to the Patriots, but now they were again back helping the British subdue the Patriots. So Washington was no stranger to adversity. He had lost many battles up in New York through the fault of his new subordinates and other factors. So he wasn't going to just give up and say, okay, we'll let them have the southern states. He actually had to do something about it. What he originally wanted to do, instead of sending Gates, he wanted to send Nathaniel Greene, who was his best commander after Benedict Arnold, but of course Benedict Arnold was of no value to him now. He fought in all the major battles in the North, and he did very well. And he was a Quaker who wasn't supposed to believe in violence or being in the military, and he gave up his faith because of his faith in the new country. He was a top commander in all respects because he knew logistics, administration, and he was a brilliant man in leading troops on the battlefield. Even though he was a successful businessman, he identified with the working men that were in the American Army. Another leader, typical of Americans, is this gentleman here in homespun jacket and trousers. His name was Daniel Morgan. He became a brigadier general starting as a captain at the beginning of the war. He was the ultimate leader of men. He started with a small group of about 100 riflemen who were deadly shots. And in many of the battles, they turned the tide because they were picking off British officers. And once the officers were gone, it was very difficult to try to maintain the momentum of the attack. Two other leaders that came along that were valuable to ensuring success were Lieutenant Colonel William Washington, who was a distant cousin of George Washington, also from Virginia, and Major Harry Lee, known as Light Horse Harry, who was father of Robert E. Lee, which I think many of you know. They were cavalry leaders that were really aggressive. They were like Tarleton, except they didn't go around butchering people. Many times they took on cavalry forces that were twice their number, and they still defeated them. If I get to do my Ollie presentations again, you'll see that Morgan was very valuable, and Colonel William Washington were in defeating a much better trained and larger British Army at the Battle of Camden. And that's all I have. I just wanted to say that I'd like to get some feedback from you as to whether this is something you would like to have done. It will be put on YouTube, and if you feel it's good, you still get the same support here at the Senior Resource Center. We'll do one of these once a month until we can get back and do this face-to-face with you. Until that time, we hope that you will all be healthy and will be back with us.